Priscilla Wakefield. So Priscilla Wakefield was a writer. She lived in Georgian Britain, so the late 1700s. She was born in the middle of the 1700s. Do you watch period dramas at all? Do you watch Bridgerton?
Yeah.
So Bridgerton. So I want you to think of Bridgerton. So I want you to think of women in beautiful dresses, in bonnets or hats. You know, she was a woman from that era, the era of Bridgerton. And she was a writer, and in fact, you know, her husband was in business. He was a businessman, but he wasn't very successful.
Okay.
You know, his business was on the verge of bankruptcy. So she had to write in order to support herself, her children, her grandchildren. She wrote 17 books, but she wasn't just a writer. She set up Britain's first bank for women and children. And she did that in 1798. So providing financial services for women and children. And in fact, her bank accounts were so popular that men knocked on her door and said, can you look after our savings as well? And so she extended her bank to open her accounts to men. And that really set off a whole wave that spread banking from, you know, not just the elite class, but to ordinary people across Britain. So Priscilla Wakefield, I think, is one of my favourite examples. I mean, there are also, I mean, in Spanish history, I have so many favourites. So, you know, Priscilla Wakefield, she was a writer, but Anna Caro, the century before Priscilla Wakefield, was writing books. And I know there's recently been an exhibition at the Instituto Cervantes on women writers from the literary golden age of Spain. And I think there are about 30 women writers featured, including Anna Caro. And in that exhibition, you can see the receipts for her writing, you know, so she was being paid for her book. So she was supporting herself financially through her writing. So she is definitely another of my favorites. I mean, women, you know, at the time when the printing press was spreading out, at the time when publishing was first starting, women were turning that into a monetary, you know, a money-making enterprise. You know, this was really the creative economy of the 17th and the 18th century, and women were getting involved. Women were in there leading the way. I mean, some of my favorites.
Even if they have to write under pseudonyms, take for example Jane Austen. I mean,
that is true.
Best-selling author, but I mean, she didn't want to reveal her name.
No, that is true. That is true. And so she would write, Sense and Sensibility, which was her first book that she published anonymously. And then later on, her books were published by the author of Sense and Sensibility. But you know, what happened in Britain was, as people started to realise that authors like her were women, then, and in the late 1700s, early 1800s in Britain, 10 of the 12 best-selling novelists were women. Then once actually people began to accept that women were writing, what happened? Do you know, you even got men pretending to be women.
Also, Jane Austen is like more or less the time of Industrial Revolution, and you have like some really original and groundbreaking theses about the Industrial Revolution that people have always wondered, like, why did the Industrial Revolution took place in Britain, which was like
a tiny little island on the edge of Europe? No, absolutely.
Why? I mean, and you have the answer. I mean, people didn't realize.
Absolutely. I mean, Britain, for most of history, has been, you know, really poor. Yeah. And in fact, Europe, for most of history, was relatively poor because China, India, and the Middle East, these were the wealthiest parts of the world. So how did Britain, that was on the periphery of a region that was itself peripheral to the global economy, become the richest economy in the world in the 19th century? How did it move from poverty to prosperity? Such an important question, because if we can answer that question, doesn't that give, you know, hope and possibility for poor countries today? Yeah. You know, sadly, there are still so many poor parts of the world. And if Britain was able to rise from poverty to prosperity over the course of 100 or 200 years, then that, gives hope if we can draw the right lessons from the past. And I think, a lot of people believe that the answer is to be found in empire, that Britain built this empire and colonized the world, and that was the root of its riches. I think no. I think no. Exploitation doesn't deliver long-run economic growth. It is liberation that delivers long-run economic growth. And I find, I argue that in particular, it was the freedom of ordinary women in Britain that helped to drive the economy forward. Now, it's when you think about the past, when you think about the 1600s, 1700s in Britain, you don't automatically think this was a great time for women. But when you compare women's lives in Britain at that time with, say, women's lives in China or India or the Middle East, they lived much freer lives. And one piece of evidence of that is the average age at which women got married at that time. Yeah. Now, at that time in China, India and the Middle East, there was a lot of child marriage. Sadly, still in India today, there's a lot of child marriage. So pretty much all women were married by the age of 17 or 18. But in Britain, the average age that women got married was 25 or 26. I mean, remarkably modern age. Yeah. And we know this for sure. I mean, sometimes people question, wonder, can this really be true? But we know it for sure. We know it for sure because church records are so good. So we know from churches, up and down Britain, from the marriage registers, that yes, women on average did not marry until they were 25 or 26. And before that time, teenage girls went out to work. They left their family home and they went out to work, whether that was, as working on a farm, or whether it was in domestic service, as a servant, or whether it was in the growing number of workshops and factories, producing cloth, for example. So it was normal for teenage girls to go out to work. And because they were through that earning their own money, that is what enabled them to take charge of the marriage decision, to decide for themselves whether, when, and who to marry. So to escape from that practice of child marriage that existed in other parts of the world. And so what happened actually is a good chunk, between about 10 and 15% of women didn't marry at all and lived independent lives. Because women married later, then that meant that they had smaller families. If you're producing children from the age of 16 or 17 versus from the age of 25, you have a much smaller family. And the result was, this I think created 3 or 4 big advantages for the economy. So the first one was because the average family was smaller, population growth didn't reach the extremes that would undermine the economy, undermine the environment, undermine wages in the economy. And so because population growth was lower, then people were more scarce, workers were more scarce, and that meant that they could demand higher wages. So workers were paid on average more in Britain than they were, say, in China, India, and the Middle East at that time. And because workers were more expensive, businesses had an incentive to mechanize, to not just use people, but to use machines alongside people. And when we think about the Industrial Revolution, we think about machines, we think about technology. So this really is inspiring, incentivizing the technological transformation of the economy. And at the root of that technological transformation is women being able to make their own decisions about marriage. And with it, then, fertility, population growth, helping to support that higher wage, higher innovation economy. And then in addition to that, the fact that women are marrying later and having these smaller families means that the average family could better afford to save and invest. And that helped to provide funds, for the family business, to, again, invest in machines and technology, but also to invest in what as economists we call human capital, so to invest in skills. This was a time before free education. Yeah. So if you wanted your children to learn to read and write or to be trained, you had to pay for it. Mm-hmm. So if you're a family with, say, 10 children, you can't afford. If you're marrying later, you have a smaller family, there's a greater chance that you can afford to educate your children. Mm-hmm. And in fact, earlier we mentioned Priscilla Wakefield, the writer, the Georgian writer from the era of Bridgerton, and she wrote 17 books. Most of those books were for homeschooling, so that people could buy books and teach themselves, learn to read and write and learn about the world. So, but the other thing is that I do think that when women go out to work and earn their own, way in the world, that challenges political structures that are authoritarian, that are dictatorial. Because really at the root of dictatorship is patriarchy within the home. Mm-hmm. So, if within the home women are brought up to obey, then, as a society, we learn to obey. Mm-hmm. We don't learn to question, to hold our rulers to account, to protest, to have our voices heard. So, for the development of democracy, what you need is within the home, people to be standing up to the patriarchy, people being brought up to question rather than to shut up. And so I do think that as women challenge patriarchal systems within the home, they're at the same time sowing the seeds for democracy. Mm-hmm.